I want to thank the organizers for this really important discussion that we're going to have today. It's a long time coming with the storms that seem to be getting in our way every time, so I'm glad we're here. So we're here to discuss some very important issues, racial injustice, which stretches back to the origins of the country and is reflected continually in the news and social media today. Our conversation will range from structural issues to personal experiences, from law, history, literature, and to our deepest beliefs. And these are not meant to be abstract ideas, but concrete realities that shape us personally and as a society. It's our intention for this event to foster connections between individuals and groups, building on shared perspectives, and exploring areas of difference. And so these two wonderful professors and my colleagues bring not only a professional expertise to these questions, but also their experiences. So I will turn first to Professor Andra Gillespie, who's an associate professor of political science at Emory University, where she teaches courses on race and politics in the US. In addition to her article publications, she's the author of The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, Newark, and Post-Racial America. And she's also the editor of Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Black Leadership. And her current research focuses on political leadership of the post-civil rights generation. And as an aside, we went to grad school together, so it's great to see her. The academic world's very, very small. Yeah. Professor Daniel Kim is an associate professor of English and American Studies here at Brown, and where his primary research field is 20th century US literature, with a particular focus on the Asian American and African American traditions, ethnic studies, gender studies, and the Cold War. In addition to his article publications, he's the author of Writing Manhood in Black and Yellow, Ralph Ellison, Frank Chin, and the Literary Politics of Identity, and he co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Asian American Literature. And currently he's working on a book provisionally titled, and soon to be finished, no pressure, The Intimacy of Conflict, A Cultural History of the Korean War. So two very amazing people. So to begin, I want to give you all a chance to hear from them a little bit more about yourselves. So Dr. Gillespie, you're speaking as a Christian here tonight, as well as a political scientist. So could you give us a brief sketch of your personal story in terms of your faith and how it's led you to focus on your scholarship on issues related to race?
Well, thank you for having me. I see familiar faces in the crowd, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I was thrilled when I found out that Dr. Hamlin was going to be moderating tonight. I became a Christian at a really young age. So I grew up in a house where my mother became a Christian when I was about 6 months old. And my father's faith walk is very, very different, and so I wouldn't describe him as actually being an active Christian, and that's been the case for a long period of time, but my mother has been a really strong Christian for a number of years, and when I was a small child, she told me about Jesus, she told me about sin, and my need for a Savior, and so with the best of my toddler understanding, I accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior, because I knew I'd done some bad stuff, and I didn't want to go to hell. So, you know, and I think that's, you know, as much as a precocious toddler can understand. As I got older, I think when you do become a Christian at a young age, you have to reaffirm that commitment. I think oftentimes we think about Christianity, especially because it has been the dominant cultural force in America, as being something that, you know, one kind of walks into or inherits. But Scripture teaches that one has to accept Christ for their own. And for themselves. And so as I got older and as I grew and matured and developed and you know, understood a little bit more, there were critical junctures in my life as a teenager and as a college student when I really had to make the decision that this is what I believed and that this was what I was going to follow. And I actually even find that, especially if I move to a new place, like I have to make that decision. Am I going to follow Christ in this city, right? Because it's a clean slate. I can just, you know, go do other things. People don't know me as well. You know, it's a decision that I made. It's something that you know, is a firm conviction in, you know, for me personally.
Thank you. Dr. Kim. You're coming from a secular perspective. Could you give us a brief sketch of your story, including the influences that have shaped your beliefs and how that's influenced your academic interests?
Yeah, it's really nice to be here. This is, I have to admit, this is a very unusual forum for me to be talking to students. I usually am teaching literature. So I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was born in Korea, but I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where there was a very strong Korean church community. But my mother, for reasons I only came to understand later, was very much at odds with that community. So we had a very strange relationship to that. And I think for me, growing up, I felt like there was only one way of being Korean, which was to also be a Christian. And our family was in a sort of strange relationship to that. And then later on in my high school years, I actually became involved with a group called Young Life, which is this evangelical organization. And I came to that when I was very lonely and depressed, and I think in many ways it saved my life. And it was really important to me. But then I think I had a crisis of faith before my senior year. These two girls I'd known since I was a kid, they got hit by a car like on the second day of classes. And just coincidentally, we read the book of Job in this humanities class I was with. And I wouldn't say that it shattered my faith, but it changed things a lot for me. And I don't think it ever got to the point where I felt comfortable with having faith of that particular kind. Where things have shifted recently, 6 years ago, and this is a very awkward thing to sort of say publicly, but I guess I kind of have to given the topic, is I became a member of a 12-step recovery program. And the sort of literature for these programs is based on Christian principles, and I had a little bit of unease about that. But that's something else that saved my life, and a lot of the principles of that program are very Christian principles, and they've become very central to how I interact with the world. And I think the other thing about the community I'm part of, it's the most diverse community in racial, ethnic, sexual, gender terms that I've ever been a part of. And at that level, it's been incredibly rewarding for me. And I think the biggest thing that came from that was having a deep sense of respect for people of faith, of different kinds of faith. And that's, so I think I don't know if I would have done something like this 7 years ago. I think I would have been too uncomfortable to speak to this, but I'm glad to be here tonight.
So it sounds funny given who we are. When did you first become aware of race? And in what ways has explicit or implicit racism affected you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I can pinpoint the time where I think in my family, and I'm not the only person who's had this experience, and I won't tell their stories in detail, but it seems to be around age 4 is when I figured out, and some of my relatives kind of figured out that we were African American, and I implicitly figured out that being Black was kind of lower on the social hierarchy. So the way it manifested itself for me as a 4-year-old, and I'm going to use the terminology that I would have used at the time in the early 1980s, was I announced to my mother that I was running away to China to become an Indian. And so I was fascinated with Pocahontas. Told my mom I was going to name my first child Pocahontas. And I thought this stuff was cool. And I grew up in Central Virginia. So I actually grew up down the street from where Pocahontas lived with John Rolfe. The middle school I went to is John Rolfe Middle School. Pocahontas is on the flag of the county where I grew up. So there was this fascination with it. I didn't know that, nobody told me about the Trail of Tears, nobody told me about reservations, nobody told me about how socioeconomically Native Americans are the most disadvantaged people in the United States. In my own way, I guess I was exoticizing the other, but what I was trying to do was get away from something that I implicitly know, and it wasn't my neighborhood. I grew up in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. My church was predominantly African-American, but somehow I just picked up by osmosis that Black wasn't the best thing. And that was something that I definitely struggled with, and maybe some of you have struggled with this. I've had these conversations with friends. When you are identified as gifted and you're Black, then sometimes that also makes you feel a little bit awkward and a little bit out of place as well. So, on the one hand, there are people who, make fun of you if you talk white or if you're interested in things that aren't necessarily stereotypically Black. And then on the other hand, you'll have teachers say kind of racist things. So like my mother will never forget my 7th grade English teacher, in a parent conference saying people must be really happy in your neighborhood because I got an A. in her class, and it was like, yeah, okay. Or, being told, you speak very well. I got told that as a TA at Yale, and I remember having to announce in class, yeah, well, in Virginia, where I come from, we speak English. What did you expect me to come in here speaking Ebonics or something? Like, whatever, this is Yale. And so, like, those things definitely shaped me. And as an undergrad, I think I did a lot to try to minimize race or to try to, in some ways, be colorblind, and didn't realize how racist I was being, especially internally as a teenager. And when I went to college, I started taking classes. So I went to college thinking I was going to be an international lawyer. And so I then took a class in race and politics in the United States, and that completely, changed my life and changed my career trajectory. I was probably already going to go into the academy, but it was taking classes like Paula McLean's class, or taking African American history classes, which was actually the first class that I took, that really started to help me understand who I was. So I think I became comfortable in my identity as a Black person intellectually. And I know not everybody has that experience, but that was actually probably the best thing for somebody who kind of stays in their head a lot. So it worked out pretty well for me.
Well, I guess for me, I didn't really think, well, I knew I wasn't white, I knew I wasn't Black, and where I grew up, that was what race meant. And I knew I wasn't Korean the way the other kids around me were Korean. And so I just, at some level, I don't think I tried not to think about it too much, but at the same time, I'm an English professor, so I loved literature from an early age, and when I look back, the books that most spoke to me, or the first books that really sort of grabbed me as literature, were Huck Finn and Black Boy. So these were books that were about race, and they're also about, I think, racialized masculinity. So at some level, I think these books they were sort of my way to figure out where I fit in. But it was kind of inchoate at that moment. And then when I grew up in Ann Arbor and went to the University of Michigan for school, and there was not a lot of Asian American activism, and Asian American was not a word that I felt very comfortable using to describe myself. But at the same time, in college, I became very much interested in African American history and culture. And I think a really formative experience for me was watching the documentary Eyes on the Prize. And I wanted to do my part. I guess I thought of myself as sort of an ally in some way. I think the way that I found out about going to grad school was actually kind of racist. This white professor, I was doing well in this 18th century class, and he very awkwardly said, I think someone like you might be a very good candidate or attractive candidate for graduate programs in English. And I didn't know what the heck he was saying. But I realized what he was trying to, in his awkward way, say was that Asian Americans were considered underrepresented minorities, so that I could be the beneficiary of affirmative action scholarship. So he didn't say it that way, but sort of put that together later. Even though that was kind of messed up, it was actually a gift for me, because up until that moment, I never really thought about how professors became professors. I didn't really know who grad students were. I just knew they graded my papers, but I didn't know that they were actually learning to become professors. So it was kind of a messed up way for that door to be open for me, but it did. And I did go to Berkeley, actually, on an affirmative action fellowship. And I was talking to Cindy before, but I think for Asian Americans in the Midwest, going to California is it's like Muslims going to Mecca. It's like a Hajj. It's a pilgrimage every Asian American who doesn't grow up in California should make at some point in their lives. And what floored me was that there were so many different ways of being Asian American. And I went to Berkeley in the Bay Area, and that I didn't feel weird anymore, that there were so many. I was just to inhabit public space and not feel like you stood out racially was a watershed for me. But anyway, and at the same time, I was very resistant to the idea that I should study Asian American literature because I was Asian American, and that was an opportunity there. So it took me a while to actually shift my thinking, and I have a story about that, but maybe I'll come back to it later. But I think that's when I first became politicized and when I first started thinking myself as part of a racial group. And the last thing I want to say about those years was that the Korean Americans I knew at Berkeley, they were kind of in two camps. The Korean Americans who were politically active, there were those of us who were like interested in domestic race politics and the relationship between Asian Americans and African Americans. The LA uprisings had just happened, so that source of tension was really key. But there was another group of Korean American students, and some of them were Korean nationals, and their sense of politics was all about what was going on in South Korea and the military dictatorships there, and the potential for reunification. And there was a lot of animosity and tension between those two different views. And ironically, what's happened in recent years is I've become more diasporic in how I think of my identity and also my scholarship, and now I don't think of these two impulses as diametrically opposed. And actually, I think they could work in harmony, and yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
We could talk about this forever, couldn't we? Okay, so you've both talked about your personal experiences with racial bias. What are your experiences with structural racism, which I guess some of you've kind of touched on that too, but as a political scientist, what have you found in the field and in the academy that you might want to share?
So, I mean, there is the sort of putting on the professorial hat and then talking about those kinds of things. As a social scientist, we could look at various measures. And if we take kids of different races born on the same day to parents and we control for class and keep all of that equal, we can predict life chances based on race. So you can look at one kid and be like, you're probably going to die first. You might not graduate from high school. You're more likely to go to jail. You're more likely to suffer certain types of diseases or get poor quality health care, even if you can afford to have high quality health care. So that is kind of the textbook definition of structural racism. As part of my scholarship, and I direct an institute for the study of race and difference, we've collected public opinion data right around the time of the election. And one of the things was interesting was that I started testing this battery out about what's racist and sexist versus what's not racist and sexist. And there are huge divergences in terms of what people perceive as being racist and sexist and what they don't. And there's a lot of consensus in the United States about obvious stuff. De jure segregation, not, helping somebody at a store because of the color of their skin, using the N-word, calling a woman the B-word or catcalling her. But when it starts to come to other types of practices that on the surface might not seem to be racial, but maybe started with racial intent or have a racial impact that's disparate, that's when people start to disagree. So, there is no consensus in this country. And in fact, the consensus is probably in the other direction about voter ID laws, and that those might be racist. And, when you hear civil rights activists talking about their objections to voter ID laws that have proliferated across the country, and it starts, a decade ago, but it's increased, especially after Shelby County versus Holder, there are people who don't see what the problem is. And it's because they aren't aware of the history that Southern states rewrote their state constitutions at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries with the express purpose of trying to get around the 15th Amendment. So no, there's nothing in, an Alabama or a Georgia or a Virginia constitution that would have said, black people can't vote. But all of a sudden, poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses start to come into play, and they knew exactly, and felon disenfranchisement. And they were really intentional about putting those things in and defining what constituted felonies in these states, because they were trying to depress African American turnout. So when today you hear people talking about rampant voter fraud that there's absolutely no evidence for, absolutely, I don't care what President Trump says, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud in the United States that would have actually changed the outcome of any election. And therefore, we have to now have these voter ID issues. Civil rights leaders have, a reason, and it's not coming out of nowhere when, they make these claims and they raise concerns about these issues. What other people see is, well, doesn't everybody have an ID? And the reality is not everybody has an ID, and that's privilege operating in that moment. And that is a manifestation of structural racism. So what I'm trying to figure out now, as a scholar, but as also a member of this country and this community who cares, is how to convince people that racism is more than just, there are a couple words you can't say, and you're not supposed to freak out if your kid brings somebody of a different race home for dinner. And no, you're not just racist because you date them, because some people are dating people for the wrong reasons, and that there are all these kinds of things, that there are these things that are actually very meaningful and that actually have an impact on how people live their lives that I don't think we're always aware of because we don't empathize with each other and walk in each other's shoes.
So as an Asian Americanist scholar, how do you assess where we are today with regards to structural racism?
Well, I mean, Asian Americans have sort of typically been positioned. Okay, I'm an English professor, so I know some of this stuff, but this is not my primary field. I read literature that sort of points to these issues, but Asian Americans have typically been thought of as the sort of middleman minority, sort of in between. But people who work on sort of disaggregating ethnicities if you look at that data, it's pretty interesting. Like people, like the Taiwanese are sort of at the top, and Southeast Asian Hmongs are at the bottom, and so there's actually a fair amount of stratification. But aside from like just thinking in terms of quantitative data about the different demographics of Asian American literature, or of the Asian American population, I think, so as an English professor who teaches Asian American literature, I think what's interesting about it is I think a lot of times what the works grapple with are questions of relative privilege. So myself, I'm always interested in how Asian Americans position themselves in their writing in relation to other minorities, and how sort of race histories in the US are linked with histories of empire, linking the US to all the country. I mean, if you think about the wars that the US has waged since the 1940s, they're all pretty much wars in Asia or the Middle East. So, I mean, I think, so those sorts of issues of structural racism are, I guess, what I think about intellectually. What I think about in terms of structural racism on a day-to-day basis sort of ties into some of the activism that happened on campus. If you look at the bodies who staff, who teach, who are in these spaces of privilege like Brown, then I think you see structural racism at work. And so it's a racism that wasn't consciously designed by people who hated people of color, but you ended up with certain racist effects. And so like how to contend with that, how to point out structural racism to colleagues, to how to find white allies in the context of all this, that's sort of where I think about that issue a lot.
Thank you. So to kind of combine some of these answers together, so Christianity has a very confusing history when it comes to race in America. And on the one hand, we have the history of slavery, where those who enslaved claimed to be Christians with a biblical mandate to own slaves. And then on the other hand, we have abolitionists like William Wilberforce, the civil rights movement activists like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who are all explicitly driven to end slavery and racial oppression by their deep Christian faith. And then we also have sort of a very deep well of Black Christians in the US, bringing us to the point where Black Americans are significantly more likely than any other racial group to actually identify as Christian. So I'm going to read this. The most extensive survey of students in the US, nearly 86% of Black students in the freshman class of 2015 identified with a particular religion, the vast majority identifying as Christian. And this places Black students 10 percentage points higher than any other racial group for religious affiliation. Asian students were most likely to select none as their religious preference, around just over 23%, while white students were most likely to identify as atheist, nearly 7%. Gender also plays a significant role, with women reporting higher levels of religious affiliation and practice, and men significantly more likely to espouse atheism. So my question to both of you, should we think about Christianity and race? How should we think about Christianity and race in America? Is it part of the problem or part of the solution, or both? That's a huge question.
Yeah, I mean, it's both. You know, I'm not going to make any bones about my community. There are things that evangelical Christians do in particular that are stupid and irritate me, like on a regular basis. You know, I have gone to church and heard people say completely ridiculous stuff. and be completely racially insensitive and would probably argue with you if we weren't in a mega church and nobody actually really knows anybody. And I've seen people do horrible things in Jesus' name that I don't think Christ would, that Christ would endorse, condone. And I think that that people are going to have to answer for that. What sustains me in terms of my faith in light of the fact that I've watched Christians do horrible things in the name of Christianity. And it's usually Christianity that's thinly veiled self-interest, that people have just figured out ways to twist stuff for their own advantage, is that I serve Jesus and I don't serve these people. So if these people were all that I saw of Christianity, yeah, there'd be a good reason for me not to be a Christian. I think Christ transcends that. And so my focus is on Christ. So my mom taught me that Jesus had bad PR. And so like sometimes I don't pay attention to Jesus's publicists because they say stupid stuff sometimes. I'll pay attention to what Christ said. And I'm not going to sugarcoat things. There are some hard things in the Bible, and things that I can't deny would, justify certain forms of oppression that we don't find socially acceptable today in American society. But what I also see is justice. And in particular, when it comes to how we treat people who are different from us, particularly those who are different because of race or class or gender, I think Scripture is pretty clear about the fact. It's the Apostle Paul wrote that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither male nor female. So this idea that you use Christianity as a bludgeon to try to oppress people, I just don't think measures up. We're told not to show respect of persons. So when people, really invest themselves in their class identity or in their privilege in particular ways, and they use it to mistreat other people, Christ is calling us to do differently and to behave differently. And I think it's a poor witness when we don't do that, because when we manifest the same pathologies that we see in regular society, and when we create some of our own pathologies, because we do, people see that, and that's a poor testimony. That's a poor reflection of Christ coming to die for all of us. So, I'm very clear that I think that Christianity and Christ's claims are both universal and exclusive. So, I think Christ died for everybody and wants to be in a relationship with everybody else, and that is the way to Christ. But the fact that it was universal, it was that God so loved the world that whosoever believed in him shall not perish but have everlasting life is real to me. And that because of that, I shouldn't be treating people differently on account of identities, whether they're ascriptive identities or the man-made ones that, like race, that we've come up with to divide each other. And sadly in America, there's just a certain type of manifestation of Christianity that likes to be blind about certain things. And so I can challenge them as a layperson, and then I also have a responsibility to take that appeal to Christ and sort of see how Christ will start to work in people's lives. And there's some people who change, and there's some people who won't, and God will deal with them. And I have to kind of take comfort in that, while I recognize that they are part of my community.
So I guess as a secularist, I think I don't think it's. I agree with what you said at first. It's neither good nor bad in and of itself, Christianity. I think for myself, I had to become more open-minded about Christianity, to see that there are so many different ways of faith to be professed. And it's ironic because when I became really inspired by the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, I remember having this very envious relationship to the black church, because by contrast, the Korean church seems so conservative, socially conservative. And one thing that's happened is I've read some histories of, it's not as rosy as it always seems. And also the relationship of the church to South Korean history is much more complicated than I initially thought. And also, so for instance, the resistance to Japanese occupation, which was quite brutal, was led by church groups of different types. So Christian didn't always mean conservative in the Korean context, which is what I'd been led to believe. And the other thing is, on a more personal note, I was involved in this sort of teach-in peace tour where we this sounds incredibly depressing, but it was also kind of inspiring as we went to different sites of atrocity in South Korea and sort of did a kind of rolling teach-in about Korean history, both the Japanese occupation, the Korean War, and also the sort of brutal military dictatorships that tortured a lot of people during the 80s. But anyway, there were two women who were Catholic nuns who were part of this group, and they were so passionate and so generous to me. It sort of opened up a whole view. And I realized that these women, their calling was totally devoted to protesting militarism in all its forms. And I just found them quite inspiring. And I think for myself, just opening myself up to an awareness of all these different kinds of religious practice has been really, has been important. And again, the 12-step program I'm part of has been part of that. There's some, I've always been, I once heard somebody say, somebody who was a Catholic priest say in a meeting that God is not in institutions. And to me, it was astonishing that a Catholic priest who is actually very invested in the Catholic hierarchy would say that, and it spoke to, it's something I could really get behind. And I guess I believe that too at the level that there is potential for the divine to enter into any kind of relationship, and you can think, and you don't actually have to be religious in a conventional way to subscribe to some notion of the divine. Or, yeah, I'll stop there.
I have so many things going on in my head that I want to say something, but I'm not going to because that's not my job. So I'm just going to move sort of closer to the theme of anger and understanding anger by looking at forgiveness. So the question of forgiveness has come into sharp focus very recently with the racist murders of the African American Christians at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston a couple of years ago, and how the community showed incredible willingness to forgive the murderer, Dylan Roof, and that impetus clearly comes from a very, very deep Christian faith, particularly at that kind of moment. It was quite profound to see. And of course, many commentators observed this act of public forgiveness and criticized it for playing into these larger narratives and unequal expectations of how Black Americans should respond to violence against them. So I guess I want to ask both of you, what role do you think forgiveness should play in struggles of racial justice? And what is the role of legitimate anger, right, and accountability as well, so the counterpoint?
So, Christ said to be angry but sin not. So I think anger has its place. I think, there is, a place for righteous indignation. The problem becomes when anger turns into bitterness, and it becomes crippling, and you can't be effective. And I think the other part about anger, if it breeds hatred, in Christianity we view that as tantamount to murder, but that also prevents you from being able to see the potential redemption that's in the person who's perpetrating things against you. And so if Christ could die to save me in my sin, even though I really hadn't built up much of a track record, it was mainly being disobedient, sassing off, and not going to bed when I was supposed to. At the time that I became a Christian, there's other things that Christ has had to forgive me for since then. That if I could be forgiven, then you have to see that other people can be forgiven and that their lives can be turned around too. So that's part of it. I was amazed when I saw the family forgive Dylan Roof at that arraignment. And I understood it as a Christian as them doing it for them doing it because that was how they were going to maintain their relationship with God. I didn't view it as them letting Dylan Roof off the hook. I've had a chance to go to Charleston since the shooting, so I went to Reverend Pinckney's funeral, and then I got invited back to do a program with PBS where I did actually get to meet some of the surviving family members, and not all of whom were ready to forgive. And they acknowledge that forgiveness is a process, and I suspect that for those people who at that arraignment said that they forgive, that's also a process for them. And that was just the first step that they were taking that particular day. Because I find that in things that have happened in my life where I have been hurt, harmed, or slighted, I forgive them, But then if I go back and dwell on it, then I have to go forgive them again. And that's part of what Christ was talking about when he said you got to forgive people 70 times 7. It's a perpetual type of process. And so, I mean, I think it's clear to know that there are people who are still working through that, and that's completely legitimate, and that they're hurt. The other thing that I thought about, like when I thought about this notion of forgiveness, there was an interesting thing, like so when went the week after the shooting, just the spirit of helpfulness. It was amazing. There were people who were handing out on the streets, handing water to people because it was hot, and it's Charleston, and Charleston is really hot. And that there was this, niceness and this unity that was that was being created. But I think there's a difference between the people who were directly affected by the shooting offering forgiveness and then what the community does. And the things that trouble me more about the forgiveness narrative with respect to Charleston have nothing to do with the family. They had to do that because Christ says, if you don't forgive others, you won't be forgiven. But it was how other people appropriated forgiveness in ways that I thought were just completely inappropriate. While I thought that then Governor Nikki Haley handled the situation overall very well, she framed that sort of in juxtaposition to Ferguson. Like, we didn't riot. And it was like, this is an apples to oranges comparison. This is an individual civilian who's killing people. People are protesting violence at the hands of the state. Don't equate them. And then there are class differences. These are middle class, middle-aged people who died. So you're going to have a different dynamic of what's going on. And I thought that that was actually really self-serving and very insensitive and classist. The other one that got me was I was in New Jersey when the shooting happened, and then I ended up in Durham, North Carolina, sort of on this particular Saturday after the shooting. And for some strange reason, I was watching Fox and Friends that morning. I don't know why, but I was watching Fox and Friends. And the lead story was the arraignment and the forgiveness. And so Tucker Carlson was still one of the anchors, and they had Robert Jeffress. So if you follow politics, he's a leading white evangelical pastor, said evangelicals shouldn't vote for Mitt Romney because he's Mormon, and Mormon theology is not Orthodox Christian theology, and he said all kinds of other things too. And they were doing this sort of like lap around the track, victory lap, yay Jesus, as though it was them. And it was like, wait a minute, how about you own the racism that produced Dylan Roof, right? Like, they're choosing to be obedient to God has absolutely nothing to do with you. So our responsibility as members of the wider American community was to interrogate how this happened, how this type of, white supremacist knowledge proliferates and takes the mind of an impressionable young man so that he thinks he can go try to start a race war. That's our responsibility. By the way, you didn't have anything to forgive. In fact, you should be really reflective right now. So I just found myself being really upset at Tucker Carlson and Robert Jeffress that day because of the ignorance. This ignorance, this refusal to acknowledge the wider forces, the structural forces that are being involved. And that's something that I think a lot of us have to be really reflective about. Those of us, who call ourselves progressive and open-minded sometimes have to interrogate the places where we have blind spots. And for those who refuse to acknowledge this is something that, you might want to sort of, take a bit of opportunity to sit and reflect and think about what people are saying, because these aren't sort of the mad stirrings of lunatic people who just want to be angry about stuff all the time. People died. And, and I think just as a commentary, I'm really happy that this Confederate flag was taken down from the state capitol in South Carolina. It shouldn't have taken 9 people getting shot for that to happen. And if that's all we get from that, that's a problem, because that, especially in his role as a state legislator, that was not what Clementa Pinckney was all about. And that's the stuff, we like these nice, neat stories to wrap it up, but because we wrap stuff up in a nice bow, we never actually solve the problem, and so the gift is still festering in many ways, so I think we have to think about that.
I guess the issue of forgiveness, I think as a personal practice, like whatever faith you have to forgive, and it's a process. And I don't think, in that case, I don't think anybody has a right to judge how other people forgive or don't forgive. That sort of exists in this one level. But I think we can also be critical about how a certain narrative about forgiveness and who should forgive can have a coercive and really negative effect. And I think from the perspective of an Asian American scholar, like one thing we always talk about Asian American studies is the model minority ideal that Asians are always sort of like positioned against or positioned as embodying. And I think a sense of forgiveness is tied to that idea that Asians are a model minority because they're always forgiving of racism. And that's a good thing. And, so I think we want to be vigilant about, when certain narratives privileging forgiveness get circulated. And, but, I almost want to distinguish that from what we individually do and the practices we make, and what you were saying about forgiveness being a process. I mean, I agree with that. And I think to bring it to the sort of day-to-day work process, I think anybody who's a faculty member of color has to encounter structural racism in the workforce, has to practice patience on a daily basis, tolerance hourly, minute by minute sometimes.
Yeah.
And it means also that you have to forgive at some level, and it's not always easy to do. And I think one thing I heard early on in my recovery that stayed with me is that you can't will forgiveness. You can't actually forgive anybody if you don't feel forgiveness. It's just not, that's just how it works. But what you can do is pray for the willingness to forgive. And so you can hold on to forgiveness as a normative ideal, but you can also acknowledge that you're human and you're not ready to go there yet. And I was thinking about this a lot after we were also at dinner talking about the aftermath of the Trump election. And the students, I see one of the students from that class here, but a lot of students, when they were sharing about what was difficult for them, was talking to friends back home who had voted for Trump, and not being able to reach out to them, and them really struggling with the message they were hearing is that now is the time for you to reach across the aisle and reach out to people who voted for Trump and not be divided. And my students were like, I'm not ready for that. Like, I'm still pissed off. Yeah. And my sense was like, yeah, because that's the natural response, and it's a human response. It doesn't mean you're going to stay there forever, but if you're not ready to reach out, don't reach out. Maybe it's more important for you in this particular moment to find a safe space where you can be at home with your anger or whatever you're feeling, and maybe that forgiveness or that desire to forgive will come at a later date. You could pray for that, you could hope for that, but it's okay if that's not where you are.
Yeah. If I could add one thing, I think some people conflate forgiveness with excusing wrong, and they also conflate forgiveness with forgetting. And no, that's just, and if I use President Trump as an example, I pray for his regeneration because our country needs it, because I would be worried about the state of our country otherwise without that change. So in that respect, I can forgive, but that by no means excuses every crazy thing he has said. And that does not absolve him of the responsibility to kind of make amends and to be held accountable. And I feel that as a Christian, I have a responsibility to demand better of my president and any of my elected officials who say completely ridiculous stuff. And I think that in part, that may be a problem with President Trump. He's saying a lot of stuff, and he's like, oh, don't worry. Like, when you have a job afterwards, like, you're not going to care about what I said. I was like, no, people actually do care about what you say, because words matter, and you're going to have to bear responsibility and take accountability for the things that you said and apologize, because that's probably why we're not going to have reconciliation until he and his ilk kind of take responsibility for the things that they've said and the things that they have now done now that they're in power. And so because of that, I'm not forgetting the things that he's done. So I can't forget how he started off his campaign. I can't forget the policy proposals. I can't forget the policies that he's enacted. Even while I'll say that, that as a Christian, you want to sort of, hold the door open and be out to him. Part of holding that door open would be, if I were sitting and having a conversation with him now, would be to tell him everything that he's done that's wrong and try to put it in some historical context, because it's clear, to me at least, that he has no sense of history at all and doesn't really understand why people are upset.
He doesn't care.
And he doesn't care, right? And so, but there's just a profound ignorance there, and I'm not sure that I would get through to him, but I don't think that as a Christian, my forgiving him means that I don't bring up everything that he has done in the last 40 years that I know about that's on YouTube, to say, do you understand why people have a problem with this, with us? This is wrong. I need you to acknowledge that this is wrong, and I need you to do differently.
I think a lot of, sort of talking about this past election as well, sort of in my church community, many of them did vote for Trump, and sort of me coming into terms with, these are people I worship next to, and now I don't want to be next to them.
Right.
So what do I do with that?
Yeah.
And it took a few weeks of me stomping around. My husband's the pastor of this church, so it got a bit interesting. Yeah, but we're all good now.
I'm
But
still
it took a
still
while.
working. I'm
It's
still
a lot.
working. I heard the world's most insane sermon before the election. I was shocked. I'm still kind of working through. Part of that is recognizing that I'm probably not going to stay at this church much longer, because I'm not sure that they're at a place where they're ready to have that reconciliation. But it's also given me a heart, because I think that there are some people who, if they are just told and people kind of explain to them a little bit more, they haven't had the benefit of a Brown education, or they haven't had the benefit of being able to take a class, in African American studies or in Asian American studies or in Latinx studies, to be able to understand why people, have the perspectives that they have. And I know that not everybody's going to be convinced by that, but I think that there is an opportunity.
Right, and I do think the education aspect is key. And having sort of that, being in that space to acknowledge that it's because they don't know. Like a lot of people, especially the circle I'm in, they just haven't had the world experiences that I've had to make a better judgments and better decisions. But we should move on. I'm actually going to start with you, with this one. So building on all of this, sort of, given that only a small minority of Americans actually identify as secular, and that the fraction of Black Americans who identify that way is probably even smaller, what resources do you see in your worldview for combating racial injustice in this country, if it's not through?
Oh, well, I mean, the virtues and beliefs that I prize in Christianity are also virtues and beliefs that are found in other religions and other belief systems. So, mercy, charity, forgiveness. I don't think, no offense, but I don't think Christians have a monopoly on those virtues. I think those. I'm not sure I agree with how the question's worded. I know you didn't write it, but I think the other thing about the thrust of the question, though, is I do think it's incumbent on progressive Christians to put their voices out there and to justify their progressive beliefs on the basis of their faith, to sort of to push against the sense that evangelical means conservative, means racist, means homophobic. And I know that and I only mean progressive Christians, I mean like progressive people of all faiths should make their faith explicitly part of why they have these progressive ideals. So I think that would be, I know people are already doing this, but I think the more of that there is, the better. And I think those of us who are secular need to be aware that not everybody is secular, and that we can't always we can't always assume that religion is monopolized by the right, and that there needs to be greater respect for people who couch their beliefs within Christianity or other religions.
So for me, you started off by saying that racism is America's original sin. And I completely agree with that. And that makes sense to me because I have this theological concept of original sin, this notion of I was born, I inherited a sinful nature that separated me from God. And the reason why Christ came and lived a sinless life and died and was resurrected was to prove, was to not just be an example for me, but to also pay the price for my sin so that I could be reconciled back to God. And so I think because of that, I think that gives me a little bit more kind of charity and perspective. I think it tempers some of my cynicism. In some ways, I'm not surprised when people do crazy racist things because that's inherent of a sinful nature, and Christ died for that. So it sometimes allows me to dissociate a little bit and to sort of be able to maintain my own sanity, to recognize that part of this is people's nature that's kind of coming forward when it's unregenerated. It's frustrating when it's people who claim to have been infused by grace. But I recognize that they are in a process of sanctification at the same time. So I think because of that, it gives me hope that people have the ability to be able to turn around. And when I don't see that happening, I know it's because people are choosing not to. It's not that they're incapable of it. I think with Christ's help that, we are capable of turning that corner and not showing respect to persons while, honoring the cultures that have emerged in our global society over millennia.
So I'm going to collapse the last couple of questions that we have here to sort of ask you to give advice to students who want to talk about racial difference through the lens of faith, particularly, and how to start dismantling what they're seeing in their everyday lives, right? So we can talk systemically, we can talk institutionally, but on the day-to-day, how do we have these conversations and strive to do better? And in the same vein, how do you promote hope? Because so far everything's been pretty depressing, what we've been talking about. But there has to be some light at the end of the tunnel. And so how do you define that light?
Okay. Well, one, for college students in particular, I would encourage college students to take advantage of the resources that are here and the fantastic work that's being done here. My school doesn't have an Asian American Studies department. I wish we did. Or a program.
We don't have a program, but there's a bunch of us here.
Yeah, there really isn't anybody at my school. And so take advantage of that. I don't always see people availing themselves of the courses and the scholarship that's available here, because it's really helpful in helping to put things into context and helping to arm you with the knowledge so it's not just your feeling that's coming forward. It's something that can be based in something that's empirically grounded. So, I think that's the first thing that you can do. I would also encourage people, if there are causes that you believe in, and I know I'm talking to Brown students, and there's definitely the Ivy League stereotype of a Brown student, but don't be afraid to get involved. And also don't be afraid to get involved with people on certain issues if you have common ground on one issue, but you don't necessarily share common ground on other issues. I know that that's been a quandary for lots of evangelicals with respect to Black Lives Matter, and I just think that that's a false equivalent. I just don't understand. If there's a march or a rally that is promoting something that you don't agree with, then fine, but can't we all agree that people shouldn't be shot by the cops for no good reason? Right, and so there's no reason to not stand up for these issues and to join in partnership with working toward working towards justice in that respect. And then I think a lot of things just have to do with self-reflection and humility, recognizing privilege and recognizing that everybody has different privileges. So if we're thinking about this intersectionally, there are times when all people are relatively advantaged, and then there are instances where people are relatively disadvantaged. And so making sort of affirmative positive steps to not abuse advantage. There are times when that privilege can actually be really, really helpful. So there are ways, if you look in the New Testament, that the Apostle Paul's background as having had a high position in the Jewish community in Jerusalem, having been well educated, actually gave him entree to talk about certain things. But there are also ways that you got to check your privilege at the door sometimes, and recognizing that sometimes from the structural standpoint, there may be things that don't look apparently racist, but there are ways that sometimes certain men in particular feel that they always have to have the first word. And be mindful of that. And try to consciously sort of change your behavior in how you operate, and I think that will sort of allow you to see where you might have been unknowingly abusing your privilege, and that those little things will actually help you forge bonds with people who maybe didn't want to talk to you. And I think probably the final thing, the thing that I share with my students all the time, especially in light of this election and the fact that people were shocked that so many people voted for Donald Trump, is it's easy to stay in a bubble with people who look like you or think like you, or who have the same background as you, but I think you should be really intentional about making sure that you go get to know other people. So I told my own students in my freshman seminar last semester, spend time in flyover country, and I don't mean to go skiing in Vail. And for that reason, because people really kind of, had this sort of coastal notion of what was going on in America. And I mean, if you look at vote returns on the coastal counties, they all voted for Hillary Clinton, and then people in the middle didn't. And that's why we got the election results that we did. So taking an opportunity to kind of get outside of oneself and intentionally get out of your comfort zone and get to know somebody, not necessarily to try to convert them, right at the onset, but actually really get to know and understand and see the humanity in that person, and recognize that God created them the same as He created you, and He loves them the same way that He loves you, I think would actually be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said. But I think I would add one other thing, because I do think it's important for us to, I think it's always important to talk to people who don't agree with you already, who are a different background than you. But I also think what I see happen a lot with Brown students is they get frustrated because they want to figure out the magic bullet global solution to the problems. And right now, Trump there, it's just so big that it can get really demoralizing. So I think it's just, you got to do what you can do where you are. As simple as it sounds, but there are smaller battles to be fought wherever you are, and wherever you guys end up after college, there's going to be little battles to be fought, and all those little things can add up, and so for me, for me, I'm a teacher, right? I'm a professor, so my teaching, and stuff that's happening with the DApp at Brown, I think Brown could actually become a much better place in the next bit, and a number of faculty of color have been and white allies have been very active on that front, and that work seems all the more urgent now. So I think it's important. And the last thing is just more personal, and it's partly goes back to me being an English professor. I don't turn to scripture, but some literary works and some, one of my favorite pieces of literature is actually the St. Francis Prayer. And as somebody who's not religious, that piece of literature spoke to me, because when I said the words of that prayer aloud, and they weren't directed to a God figure for me, I could feel part of this community that had been comforted by those words over the years. And that kind of feeling, I think some of my students get from literature, and when that happens, I'm very happy about that. And I think my favorite story from last semester is I got a student, the day after the election, I was trying to figure out what to do in my class, and I bumped into this student. She was crying, and her family are refugees from Vietnam, and she just was telling me she couldn't come to class, she was just too upset. And then, and I did keep in touch with her, but a couple weeks later, she told me that she just needed to take a day and go to the beach and bring a copy of this Vietnamese American novel called The Gangster We Are All Looking For. And she said she just read herself passages from this novel, and she found comfort in that. And I do think in these times you got to find comfort where you can find it, and to me, I find it in literature sometimes, and I find it in religious literature sometimes. So I think that part of it's important too.
Yeah. Oh, Q&A.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, questions and questions from the floor. Please come to the mics, and our fearless panelists will do their best.
Let's see, where's the best place? Hello.
Hi.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank all three of you, because it was nice to hear this. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. My great-great-granddad was a preacher. My great-granddad was a preacher. My granddad was a preacher.
Zero PK.
Yeah. I'm all the way down there. But one thing I was wondering coming into this, and was wondering if I could get a bit of, clarification, mainly from you, I suppose, is especially thinking about modern race theory, I think a lot about Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality. And I wonder, looking through a Christian lens, how it is that you can analyze race without or not necessarily, through a Christian lens, can you analyze race through the intersectional like lens where you think, I mean, can you talk about race without recognizing that the most affected people within POC spaces are the LGBT community? So yeah.
Yes, I mean, I have no issues with using intersectionality sort of as a theory in my work. I don't feel that it conflicts at all with my faith. And it's funny because I first became familiarized with intersectionality, not through Kimberly Crenshaw, but actually through Kathy Cohen. And so in terms of thinking about it, because she taught us. In thinking about it that way, I could actually then think about how intersectionality works in other dimensions as well. So I would not, my scholarship would not be enriched had I not thought about how race and sexuality interact with one another. Yeah, I mean, I don't see that there's a conflict intellectually with taking anything. I mean, I've said this at other forum before. There are other things like, I think sometimes evangelicals are like, oh, we can't do anything with Marxism. And I think that, sometimes there are questions of what you personally believe with, and then whether or not this is an intellectual framework that helps you understand the world and helps you understand positively what is going on out there. And so I think in terms of thinking about how people see class and how class affects them, or how people's gender identities or sexual identities affect them, that really kind of comes down to, if I'm gonna understand the world and all of its complexity, I can't pretend that stuff isn't out there. So, I mean, I don't see that there's a conflict at all.
Well, then what about from the intellectual activist standpoint? Then is that where there's a clash maybe?
Well, I mean, there are probably going to be some places for some people where, there's certain things that they probably won't endorse, but I think that they're basic things that, in terms of recognizing people's humanity. So, people should have the right to be able to work. You shouldn't be denying people jobs. People should have the right to be able to live in their own bodies. So I think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. So if I see a Black trans person and they are, being bullied, then who is my neighbor in that moment is them. I think as a call to justice, I have the right to come in and try to protect them. So, I mean, yeah, we're gonna have differences in terms of expressions and how people deal with identity, but that doesn't mean that you sit around and sort of pretend that stuff isn't going out there, or that you let people be sacrificed because of that. I don't think Christ calls us to that. Right. I mean, yeah. I don't see the problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. My dad is an Episcopal minister, and he didn't. I know there's a lot of us here. He didn't. Obviously, he felt an enormous amount of discomfort following the election, and as someone who's a very quiet intellectual, he didn't express that openly to us until fairly recently, when he felt very moved to ask us in an email, what can people of my age do? Because we have a very active, it's easy for us to feel active socially and regarding these issues on a college campus, because by nature of being here, we are in the middle of it. But for, a man who lives in Franklin, Tennessee, a historically conservative community, as a liberal, what can he do to feel heard and feel like he's making an impact? And what in your studies have you found is a good way for him to spend his time to add his voice to this narrative that's primarily a youthful narrative? Well,
First of all, I don't see the narrative as being youthful, and I think people of all generations have a responsibility to contribute to this conversation. It's funny, when one person goes to college, their family can go with them. And so if you come home and you're talking about the things that you're learning, you'll be surprised about the ways that is going to impact your family, and then that might carry over into their conversations with their peers. So you may not be able to challenge, their friends' racist comments, but by your witness and your testimony, they may become uncomfortable to the point of becoming unmuzzled as a result of that. So you would encourage in their space then for them to educate their peers the same way you seek to educate yours.
Is the church conservative?
He was originally in a church in Connecticut and has since done sort of his own personal writing in different areas. So the church he's a member of is actually incredibly liberal and incredibly open.
Working on making that space a safe space for other like-minded people in this sort of, make it an oasis in that space is a way in which they can be, the community can be, as a community, right, be supportive and do this kind of work of education is really important.
Yeah, I also think it's great that he if he's normally reticent, the fact that he reached out to you, that's worth acknowledging and validating, because I think that itself is a gesture, and it speaks a certain level of humility. But just do what he can where he is. And it sounds like he already is.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thank you all again for just being here and all of your insight. I guess my main question is that, okay, so at Brown, I feel like I've gotten this experience where it's very dichotomous. So it seems like, oh, we're all the liberals, and as long as we're not Donald Trump, or as long as we're not Dylan Roof, we're good, or something like that. And a lot of times it sounds like, oh, what can we do to help the conservatives understand, or something like that, and there's not really a discussion on what people who call themselves liberals can actually do, and can do to end up hurting Black people still, or hurting other people of color, or what Black people can do to hurt one another, or things like that in various ways. And I know that you touched on the concept of intersectionality, but I'm just wondering how that interacts with faith specifically, in terms of I know everyone wants to be the heroes of our own story, but I also am Christian, and I believe that Jesus is the hero of my story. And so how can that concept of humility and forgiveness work when you're not the one who's doing the forgiving of others, or not the one educating others? How can someone actually humble themselves and receive critique, or actually change that opinion? Because a lot of times, like you said, we're in this brown bubble, and we think we're all good, and there's nothing we think we're progressive, whatever that means, and there's nothing else that we need to do.
That was a lot of questions. I think one of the things I heard you saying is what do you do with people who don't actually live by Christian values around you, right? If you want them to have a certain humility and openness that is important to your faith, and how do you get them to sort of see that they're not acting that way? Is that sort of part of what you were saying?
I guess just how you can change someone's behavior if it's not necessarily that it has to be based on tell them the Bible and then they'll change their behavior, but how can somebody have that concept of humility to actually change their views or change their behavior?
I think you said you can't. Did somebody say that over here? Yeah. You want to say that again?
You can't really change someone's behavior. I think that's where you leave it to God, I think the best thing to do in that situation is to intercede, to pray for them, and to be a model by living that example. But to actually try and change them, you can't do that directly.
You want to be up here? That was a great answer.
Yeah.
There's something about having integrity in your daily life, so that you don't have to tell people you're a Christian. They should be able to see it.
But they might not, and that's not up to you. That's up to a higher power. It's up to God. How other people act, you can't control. But you
can control your own reaction to it.
So not changing other people's behaviors, but how we can look and take on humility for ourselves, as people who call ourselves liberal or whatever, how we can recognize that we can also hurt each other and
Right.
It was funny, when I first heard your question, I thought of Jim Sleeper's liberal racism or colorblind racism, like all of these things that are intended to be good but actually have really pernicious effects. And oftentimes those things really kind of relate to our lack of understanding about structural systemic racism and privilege. And so that's where the transformation needs to happen, that's where the realization needs to happen. And I think for people who would self-describe as being liberal or progressive, there is sometimes an arrogance that comes along with, well, I have everything figured out. And I'm starting to tell my students now, 20 years from now, your kids are gonna point out what you did wrong, like during Black Lives Matter. And they're gonna have a critique of this, and you're gonna be the old fuddy-duddy one day. So like, y'all look at me now, but watch, one day this is gonna come really quickly for you. And so I think part of it is that there's this humility and that there's this self-awareness that kind of has to come with that. And I think that, yeah, you can't force their hand upon people to get people to see that, but exposing yourself to arguments where people make perspectives or make points from different perspectives, and you kind of have that aha moment, that might be sort of one of those things that actually contributes to them starting to think about things from a different perspective. You're welcome.
Yeah, there's another thing. I mean, like if one of the fundamental beliefs of Christianity is our fallibility, right? That we are all mortal, we're all human, we're all fallible. We're sin, if you want to call it that. But the thing is, if we're all fallen at some level, and we live in a world that's homophobic, that's racist, that's sexist, what have you, that means that's in us too. So there's no, I mean, however much we might fight these forces, that's the world we live in. So we do what we can to also fight those things in ourselves, but I think it's impossible to think that we could think ourselves out of those structures. We could do what we can, and so I think for me, being humble is not thinking that I have it figured out. Like I can be the perfectly anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-sexist human. I mean, because that's not, you know, we can't ever attain that, right? If you believe in Christ, Christ is that's his deal, right? We aspire to that, but we can't ever get there, right?
And you're going to be doing that your whole life. Like sanctification is a lifelong process. So, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, my name is Rana, and I go to Johnson & Wales University. I do not go to Brown, but I am part of RUF. And I go through a lot of like hardships going to the school because I see like people who just like don't lighten up, and like they just like walk in with the oppressed views, and I'm just like targeted and like not listened to because like I have often like have a happy face sometimes, but also because like I'm a little bit different and I have like a different life story than everybody else has. And what I wanted to ask you was, what was the hardest thing that you guys have like ever gone through in your entire lives, and like how did you overcome it? Well, not specifically. Oh my God.
Wow.
No, I'm sorry if like that.
Oh,
made
no,
you
no,
laugh
no,
at
no.
me.
No, it's just because it's like, how much time do we have? I guess I can talk for me. I was raised Catholic, and I'm a recovering Catholic now. I met my husband at Yale, and he's a minister. And for me, that's kind of that different journey to the faith, which again is the differences between the both religions, was transformative for me, and it helped me to heal from many things that I didn't know I was suffering from. Right?
Wait, so could you say that again? Because like I couldn't understand.
Okay, so learning about my faith as an adult, and relearning a faith, right?
Like Christianity?
Well, I was a Christian. But I was Catholic.
No, because when I hear
was
faith, I
Catholic.
think
That
of
means
that.
that's weird. Sorry.
When I hear faith, I think of that also. And
Yeah. Well, the way the Catholics practice their faith is very different from Protestants. Very different. And so that sort of
That's
liberating.
what I am.
Right. That liberating. You're Catholic?
I'm a Protestant.
Right. So that liberating aspect of being a Protestant helped me to heal from things and, you know, burdens that I didn't know I had, that I was suffering from. So my faith was a way to deal with things, and sometimes it was sort of a mirror to things that I hadn't seen before. So we weren't laughing at you. We were just like, we've been around the block a few times. So
Yeah.
it was like, yeah.
But thanks anyway, though.
Oh, thanks.
But thank you for coming. That's
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I don't know.
Is there someone, we're looking at one mic, do you want to speak?
Is it okay?
Do you want to say something?
Oh.
Well, you know, when I was thinking about hard, I mean, I think part of the reason why we kind of took a breath was there are lots of hard things that we've gone through. So it would just be a question of kind of picking which one. You know, I'll say one professionally that you may not understand just yet. If some of you become professors, you will understand this a little bit more. I almost lost my job at one point. And that was professionally the toughest thing that I've ever been through, because when they sit and tell you thanks, but no thanks, we're not going to tenure you. You know, I wasn't sure what to do. And there's a scripture that says, you know, talks about the peace of God that passeth all understanding. That was the only thing that got me through, was that at that moment when I finally heard the word, there was peace. And I didn't know how it was going to work out. But I knew somehow that God was going to take care of the situation. And through a lot of prayer and a lot of support, a lot of people coming alongside me, things ended up kind of working out. So I went through an appeals process and everything worked out okay. So that's a praise report. But the reason why I tell this story is because if you work in an academic department, first word gets out. So I had to go to a conference right after this decision and had to talk to people, and everybody knew. And so there was the judgy people and the sympathetic people and then the pity people, and they all kind of got on my nerves, and I was kind of angry. And then there is you still have to deal with your colleagues. And so I can walk around the department and I know who voted to fire me, but I have to forgive them and I have to still work with them, even when I disagree with them. Like, that is a perpetual process of forgiveness, because if they say something and I know they voted against me, I could go right back to that place. And that Christ calls me not to do. That's called Christ taking kind of control of my life. So like when I think about like that in terms of dealing with it, that's something that, you know, I will probably, you know, deal with for the rest of my career in terms of going back. So yeah, I mean, there are other things that have happened, but, you know, we don't have time to tell those stories.
Well, thanks anyway.
Thank you.
So, anger, and a lot of the discussion has been anger on the one side, and we've talked about the election and anger over the election. A question that's, I think, of equal interest to me, anyway, is how did he win in the first place? And what is it that drove the motivation to elect the man?
Right. So we're still answering that question empirically.
And you can't be snarky either.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I will put on my professional TV, nonpartisan voice to answer this question. There are a couple of things that people will talk about. So historians note that moments of racial progress in the United States are often met with backlash. I think we thought that the rise of the Tea Party was the backlash, because we know empirically, and we have colleagues who've done work on this, that shows that members who identify with the Tea Party tend to harbor higher levels of racial resentment than the average American. And so we thought that was done, and the Tea Party looked like it was waning, but then it resurged in a form that I think even the Tea Party organizers can't control. So that's part of it. There's a lot of racial animus. In fact, some of this work was being done here by a former colleague here, Michael Tesler, that shows, there's a lot of racial resentment that explains opposition to President Obama. And so this was an opportunity for a reprieve. There is this notion of Washington being broken and fixing it. So the logic of some people is, why put in the same politicians over and over again and expect a different result? That seems to some people to be the definition of insanity. So when we hear alarm, they hear a breath of fresh air. And I think we still have to acknowledge that. If we look at, approval ratings for President Trump right now, the people who supported Hillary Clinton are completely aghast, and those who supported President Trump think, well, he's doing what he said he would do. And even those who don't agree with President Trump at least give him credit for kind of being decisive. And so what looks like chaos to some people looks like him setting his agenda in motion. And we have to acknowledge that. I don't discount, like I think racism explains a lot, but I also don't want to discount the importance of thinking about the role of people being left behind by globalization and that reaction to the fact that they feel like they've been left behind. But there's a racial element to that. I mean, part of the reason why we don't have, a strong socialist tradition in the United States was in part because socialists who came here to organize discounted the importance of race and how race trumped class in many instances and prevented people from seeing their common class interests. And you also see that being manifest in vote choice. So, the conference season is starting up, so the models are starting to come out, and there's going to be new data that will finally be available within the next few months where we'll start to crunch these numbers a little bit more. There are things that we didn't take into account. So we know from, say, the 2012 American National Election Study that there's a correlation between white identity and support for Mitt Romney. So those who were invested in white identity were more likely to support Romney over Obama. And that would be tantamount to the classic notion of linked fate. So we know that African Americans are as democratic as they are, and they hold socially liberal welfare policy points of view, even when they're middle class, because they are thinking about what's good for the African American community and not just what's personally good for them. And so this notion of being invested in white identity suggests that whites have an identity, and we often don't talk about that when we talk about racial and ethnic studies. We talk about the minorities, but we don't talk about the ways that whites have an identity too, and that's politically salient. And I think, if we could see it in 2012, I would be shocked if we didn't see it in 2016. And, I'm fully confident without having looked at the data that that's probably what we're going to see. So I feel pretty confident in the hypothesis, and we'll just wait for somebody to test it.
Yeah, and as a historian, and as someone who was raised outside of the U.S. and educated most of it outside of the U.S., sort of the undereducation of the population in the U.S. is startling to me, and I also think it's purposeful, right? If you don't teach Americans their own history and all of it, not the edited version, then you can't be asking them to make critical decisions, or have the tools to have a critical analysis. By the time they come to college, we teach them here, but if you're not learning that in grade school and not learning history, it's a problem. And sort of even sort of working at an Ivy League here, I see how the education system's failing our students, just in the change in a decade of the knowledge that they have. It's not, the skills are there, but it's the basic knowledge that it's lacking. It's change. I'm not saying it's lacking.
But that's an across-the-board issue, right? You wouldn't argue that people that voted for Trump are just uneducated. I mean,
no. But the undereducation is the undereducation allows for people to accept what they hear without any question. Yeah. And with social media and regular media not doing what it's meant to do, we're in this situation. So so structurally, sort of really looking at grade school education is a battleground, a real battleground to change for all Americans.
Yeah, a lot of this hate, it reminds me of when I was in college and Reagan won, and it was the whole issue of the Reagan Democrats. And especially I grew up in Michigan, so it's like, why did the working class turn out for a candidate who was so clearly against their interests? And it was hard not to overstate race as a major motivation in that, but it was also, it was the whole narrative of America that Reagan was peddling, and replacing a president, coming after a president who actually said the world is a complex place, and that as a nation we need to sort of negotiate our place in it. Like, there are some eerie parallels in that regard, and also as a student of Asian American history, it's like the way in which the white working class identity has been mobilized through xenophobia. It's over and over and over again that you see that happening. So that sadly does not come as a surprise. And actually, one factoid that I Googled and found out through a reliable source was a lot. No, it's an actual survey done by actual political scientists.
Ones I know. You're probably talking about Janelle and Teku. Yeah.
But a lot of my Asian American students last semester were really upset about their parents voting for Trump. And I did wonder, because it was a big piece of news in my circles that Asian Americans turned out quite heavily for Obama both times. And so I was relieved to find out that they came out as a group as much for Hillary as they did for Obama. So although somehow they outpaced Romney, somehow they voted more for Trump than they did with Romney. But at least that development that's happened within the Asian American population, because when I was a kid, Asians voted Republican, Republican, Republican. And so for me personally, I think that's a really positive development. So one piece of hope.
Unfortunately, we have only time for one more question.
Yeah, we only have one more. We only have time for one more question, really quickly.
Hi.
I don't know who to choose.
Is that me? All right. Hi. So I have a, yep, go ahead.
Okay.
I have a question based on a premise first that I'll explain. So the goal is to diminish or ultimately end racial bias, right? So human beings, I believe, naturally attribute ideas to certain groups of any kind, right? And this, the classic example is not to say I stand by any of these or anything like that, but rich people are like, seen as greedy by a lot of people. Men logical, women emotional, right? People from New Jersey, bad words come to mind, while Canadians are like really nice. And any kind of groupings like that, ideas come to mind that is really hard to help because humans just naturally have biases that come up towards any group of people. So sticking together as race, gender, sexual orientation, having a true identity with that group and having certain ideas develop in that group that aren't in other groups. Sticking together like that while also promoting equality and not judging anybody seems a little self-defeating. So the only way to truly eradicate bias between different groups is to have complete assimilation of everybody. It's hard to have groups of people without other groups attributing certain ideas to those groups or anything like that. It's kind of a self-defeating, there has to be a balance between the two, right? Saying like biases aren't benign or malicious in certain ways, but you have to find a balance. So like how do we find the certain balance between sticking together as a group, but also not, seeing people as different?
Well, thank you for your question. I think the issue there is, I think you're right. People have a natural tendency to want to stereotype and to want to group. Heuristics help us understand the world quickly. So in that respect, it's not surprising that people group. The issue becomes when people then start to group and then stereotype and then create narratives for domination. And that's where we get oppression from. The rich are greedy, but greed is good. So whether it's the Lockean version of it or the Gordon Gekko version of it, and so therefore you can trample on the rights of anybody else who doesn't see things the way that you do or view property the way that you do, that becomes a problem. I think the question with assimilation is you have to assimilate into something, and whatever you assimilate into becomes dominant, and then that becomes hegemonic, which is why we tend to reject assimilationist arguments. At this point in our history, we can't deny the fact that groups, especially racial groups, are made up. Biologically, there isn't any difference between people. The surface stuff is just superficial. But these things have legal imprimatur in this country, and there is a lot of history behind them. And people have developed institutions that have helped to support and to sustain themselves in the face of oppression, and actually in the face of privilege. And that there is a certain type of investment in that. And that there's a value in it that doesn't necessarily have to pit one group against another. So you can celebrate the things that provide a unique perspective, give you a different sort of perspective on the world, so long as you're not using them to oppress others. And the things we want to eradicate are using those differences to try to make oneself or one's group be better or more dominant over other groups. And so, if we think about things that you could be taught in the Ten Commandments or things that you could be taught in the Beatitudes, putting other people first, not stealing, not killing, not lying, all of those things, oftentimes people have used identity to do those things that we've been told not to do. And that's a problem. And that's where I think Christianity can kind of come in and help eradicate that. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden I'm colorblind or that I haven't forgotten, that, the Constitution, or that I haven't forgotten that, you know, my ancestors, some of my ancestors came from Africa, and that some of Daniel's ancestors came from Korea, and that there's value in recognizing the diversity of that.
I mean, I would also add that, like, I mean, the issue of assimilate to what is really important there too,
Right.
but also I think sometimes people think that if you see certain groups congregate with their own, that they're practicing self-segregation or something like that. It's something that you hear people say sometimes, but I mean, I think speaking for myself, like, I grew up without knowing that I had internalized a healthy dose of self-hatred. For being Asian American, and it had to do with and that the desire to assimilate had actually produced that self-hatred, because the thing I was trying to assimilate into had, you know, there was a kind of conditional acceptance as long as I didn't show up as different in important ways. And so I think, you know, I think there have been times in my life where I've really needed to be around other Asian Americans to help me in a predominant way, to like help me sort of get over that. But I mean, I have no interest in living in an all-Asian world, right? I don't have any interest in living in an all-white world, or, you know, I mean, it's, you know, it's so dorky and boring to like acknowledge like diversity is important, but it is. And the kind of argument you're making, you could go back to the turn of the century, the early 20th century, and that kind of argument has a history, and it was actually used by whites who thought that whiteness was exclusive to people who had sort of Anglo-German heritage, and that the problem of contamination was coming from Italians and Irish and Jews. And so, you know, a counter set of arguments got proposed by people like Franz Boas and Horace Callan. And there were problems with those ideas, but I think this is not a new debate, and it has a long history, and it's important to go back and see who's made the arguments.
Right. So I just want to make it clear, when I was talking about assimilation, I'm not saying like into white culture or like American culture or anything. I'm just saying like.
No, we weren't saying, you were saying that.
Okay, it sounded like to me like you thought I was talking about like
No.
American culture. That's what I'm talking about.
But I mean, whichever
I
you
just
assi-
meant like instead of grouping yourself, like you can still identify as race, you know, religion, but like not like I'm part of that group and not this group is what I was talking about.
Even when you say American culture, it usually reads white, right?
Which is a problem.
Yeah.